Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. If we haven't met before, my name's Phan. I'm a research fellow in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, as well as the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. I'll begin by thanking Janet so much for that beautiful welcome to country and for giving us a good education, which we always need and we're all here to do today. It's my pleasure to be chairing this brilliant panel on designing automated mobilities of care. In today's discussion, we hope to address care both as a concept and as a practice. That is, we're not just asking why we should care about the future of automated mobilities, but what definitions of care are we using? How does this shape how care is practiced and expressed on an everyday basis? And whose interests are being served? Who actually benefits from these practices? This panel explores how care is foregrounded as a practice across industry, across non-government organisations, and in academic research on automated mobilities. In preparing for our panel today, I asked each of our wonderful speakers to reflect on two key questions. The first is, what is your definition of care? And the second is, how do you apply this in your work on automated mobilities? So each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes, and we'll have them all speaking back to back with a collective Q&A and discussion at the end. So if you have a question for a specific speaker, please write it down and save it for the general discussion time. For those listening online, you're also welcome to ask questions for the panel. Just pop them in the chat and we'll have somebody sort of be surrogate for you and read them aloud. So our first speaker today is Noortje from the University of Warwick. Noortje is a professor in science, technology and society in the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. Her work investigates issues at the intersection of innovation, everyday environments and public life, the role of mundane materials and devices in participation, technology testing in society, and changing relations between social life and social science in a computational age. Please join me in welcoming Noortje.
Yeah, thank you, Thao, for that introduction, and to Sarah Ping for the invitation to be here today. I'm really excited and pleased to join you from the UK here in Melbourne. So to address the questions that Thao put to us, I would like to invite you into a particular environment. This is the driver in the loop simulator at the Warwick Manufacturing Group at the University of Warwick. This simulator at the time was celebrated as a first of its kind, a first drive-in simulator that could test any autonomous vehicle for its capacity to interact with its environment. It also, which at the time was quite impressive, had around 30 miles of roads in the West Midlands, in the middle of England, in full 3D simulation. Now, around 2016, what we called self-driving cars were being trialed on the roads of the nearby city of Coventry. At the time, it was quite difficult to find good methods for investigating the reception of self-driving cars in the city of Coventry, because the trials were mostly conducted under embargo, meaning that many citizens were unaware that these trials were even going on. So we looked for a way to start investigating what is the social reception of autonomous vehicles, what will be their impact on society, particularly in the region of the West Midlands. To answer these questions, myself and colleagues with a background in design, Lucy Kimball and Rebecca Kane, we decided to approach the engineers that had just launched this simulator to ask them if we could conduct a social research experiment in this environment. Well, we were fortunate that they responded really positively to our question. Indeed, societal acceptance of autonomous vehicles was one of the stated research areas for which the simulator was designed. So we got off to a good start. The engineers were also very happy with our plan to conduct our research in the form of a participatory experiment. So what we decided to do is to invite both researchers and policymakers and representatives from non-governmental organizations into the simulators, and to see if together we could sort of construct scenarios and then explore scenarios to see what the social impact and social reception of autonomous vehicles would be. So just for your information, we had participants from the Department of Transport, from the RAC, an automotive foundation in the UK, but also from the Royal College of Art, where designers were involved in trialing autonomous vehicles. What was less easy though, it worked quite well to invite our colleagues from these different backgrounds into the simulator, but what proved much more challenging was to prepare the environment of the simulator so that it was suitable for social research. Because in our conversations with the engineers, it became apparent that many of the features of roads and streets as a social environment were missing from the simulator. So for instance, at that time in 2016, there were no pedestrians programmed into the environment. We asked our engineers for particular places along the 30-mile route, which to us seemed suitable for staging social situations. So we would ask, for instance, could you give us a piece of road, a stretch of road, where children could be expected to be present, near a school or something like this. And the best they could come up with was the entrance to the football stadium outside of Birmingham. So there were no schools or other locations identifiable as places with children in the simulated environment. And for me, this brings me to what I think is a first very important point to me in relation to the question that Thao asked us about how to care for mobility or automated mobility futures. And this is that in order to be able to care, one needs to be able to name and identify some of the entities to care for that one wishes to develop a caring relationship towards. And what was especially challenging in this regard is that the engineers, the automotive engineers that we worked with, had very strong commitments to, as I already noted, societal acceptance of automated vehicles, but also sustainability and inclusions were ideals that frequently featured in their descriptions of the future of automated vehicles. Yet these ideals of inclusion and sustainability and acceptance, it felt to us at this time, were not operationalized. They were not translated into the environments where autonomous vehicles were actually being tested at the time. So I guess this is my the first kind of point that I wanted to make about care and automated mobility, is that to actually articulate, to define what are the entities that populate this future and populate the future environments of automated mobility is a really key contribution and also a key, I think, purpose of working with social researchers, engineers and other stakeholders in defining what is the environment of this future in social terms. So this is what one of the tasks then we set ourselves in our experiment in the simulator, where we invited our participants to annotate the environment and to populate the simulator with the sort of social beings of the future. And to help them with this, we provided cardboard props in the shape of squares and in the shape of human figures, and we asked them to label these entities. And one of the things I wanted to flag here is it's the range of entities that our participants introduced into the simulator. So you may have been able to read the notes that some introduced banks, so financial institutions as relevant. Someone else put a sticker, here you see the banks. Someone put a sticker on a vehicle called basket for roadkill, reminding us of all the animals that populate road environments. And also abstract entities were introduced into the simulator, like stigma, the effect that particular subjects may experience when they are labeled. For instance, when vehicles identify particular uses of autonomous vehicles as old ladies. Now there are maybe 2-3 takeaways that I wanted to give to you or present here more briefly in terms of what we learned about care in doing this exercise of annotating the simulator. So I'll have 3 sort of insights that I think we learned from this work. So the first is that when we bring the question of care into these kind of explorations of the future of automotive mobilities, a lot of phenomena will come to the surface that are, I think, first and foremost about constraint, about what is impossible in our future, about what cannot be done, what harm may be just around the corner. So the points around stigma, around dying animals, all kinds of entities were brought into the simulator that aren't, to which it is impossible to respond in the register of we're making things doable, we're creating a positive future. And I think this is really important about the questions around care, that issues around coping, about not coping, about what is impossible, about what harm cannot be avoided, or perhaps can be avoided, that these questions have to be part of the futuring work, which, especially in our interaction with engineers, I think it's challenging to bring that into the interaction because their training is so much about problem solving, about making things doable, making things possible. 2 more points. The next one I already gestured towards, and this is the point about expanding the range of entities that we consider relevant to the question of what future comes about. So I flagged some of the entities that were introduced into the simulator, and I think this too is something really important about this kind of creative exploring of futures with social methods and design methods, that we don't restrict the scenarios of automated mobility, and in this case automotive mobility, to sort of the narrow situations of interaction on the road. So the reflex, perhaps in social approaches to automated mobility, is to focus on the situations of use, on the scenarios of use. And these are, of course, absolutely crucial. But as I think the entities in the simulator make clear, is there are many other entities and considerations that are relevant that require us to stretch the frame of what is the situation of automated mobility. So this is what I would really like to encourage us all to be able to try and do, to expand that range of entities. And just as a very last point is to return to this question of constraint. Because the thinking through of mobility, and I think many of you are really very familiar with this, is that mobility is really closely connected with the removal of constraint. So in Britain, one of our cultural icons is Barbara Hepworth, an artist and sculptor. One of the sort of defining figures in her work is that of driving through the landscape and the freedom that she derives from that kind of movement through landscape. And I guess what I'm seeking in this kind of exploration is that we can imagine mobility in a more sort of glitchy, less seamless, and a way of doing mobility that is shot through with constraint, but therefore no less dynamic or lively. So I leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Noortje. So our next speaker is Ivana Jurko from Humanitech. Ivana's areas of practice include social policy research, humanitarian fusion foresight, and design and delivery of complex social initiatives. Since helping establish Humanitech, she is focused on understanding and developing approaches that promote digital justice. Please join me in welcoming Ivana.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Thao, and thank you for inviting me to participate today, Sarah. It's really exciting to be here. To provide you a bit of a background, Humanitech was established by Australian Red Cross in 2018 to explore the opportunities and risks presented by emerging technologies for humanitarian action. We need to go back with the slides if we can, all the way to the beginning. We run an innovation program where we work with startups that are using technology to address pressing humanitarian issues. And we also engage in research and advocacy to promote responsible, ethical, and inclusive approaches to innovation. We collaborate across sectors, including as an industry partner with the ADM+S Centre. And we believe that collective action is really needed to ensure better technology futures for many, not just a few. So while I don't work or research mobilities directly, what I will do in my remarks today is draw on the experiences from my sector and share the insights from the use of drones in the humanitarian sector as a way of exploring the central questions of understanding and defining the notion of care in automated mobilities. So drones are an increasingly common tool in humanitarian aid, with potential applications currently being tested, including needs assessment, accessibility evaluations, agricultural monitoring, landmine detection, and search and rescue. And I thought I'd illustrate that by sharing some examples to kind of showcase the potential of what we're talking about. I'm sharing a couple of pictures here. One on the bottom is from Swoop Aero, which is an Australian drone startup. And one of their offerings is to support humanitarian relief during complex disasters and emergencies through services such as mapping disaster areas to inform decisions, providing live video monitoring feeds for rapid search and rescue, and delivering medication, blood, and defibrillators. The bigger picture here is from my colleagues at the Netherlands Red Cross, who run an initiative called 510 Global. 510 Global are one of the leaders in the use of data and technology for humanitarian operations. And they provide a truly integrated disaster response using drones, satellite imagery, and open source mapping volunteers to develop rapid assessments of the situation on the ground when disaster strikes. So this image that I've shared here shows the response that they mounted in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma in 2017 in the island of Saint Martin, which is an island, half Dutch, half French island in the Caribbean. When the hurricane was approaching, 510 deployed their team rapidly to the island. And they used combined aerial imagery from satellites as well as their own drones to document the extent of devastation. They then mobilized 150 volunteers in The Hague to map structural damage, looking at scale, location, and the types of material that's needed to rebuild. Island was mapped overnight by the volunteers in The Hague, providing then the rapid and accurate insights to the response teams in the field. So just a couple of examples of just showcasing the potential and the real world use of these technologies in the sector. But as drones become an ever more regular feature of humanitarian efforts, our sector has realized that we need to work harder to build and maintain trust in the technology, because community trust is essential for humanitarian ability to deliver on their mission. As I thought I'd share this cartoon, which was developed as part of a cartoonathon session at the Humanitech Summit in 2021. While the cartoon is not directly related to drones, I think it really neatly highlights the challenges that arise when we introduce technology in high-risk contexts when working with communities in crisis. It raises those questions around trust and safety and informed consent, and to what extent it's actually possible. And it also emphasizes the importance of transparency and accountability, particularly when working with people experiencing vulnerability. So in my sector, there has been this shift from high optimism about the so-called opportunities presented by digital humanitarianism of a decade ago, to a more critical interrogation of the implications of digitalization on the sector. There has been concepts such as surveillance humanitarianism, algorithmic humanitarianism, and techno-colonialism that have emerged to describe how these tools are reshaping humanitarian practice and creating new or perpetuating existing vulnerabilities and inequities. The concern is that introduction of these tools doesn't just change how we do our work, but it challenges the fundamental principles of humanitarianism, especially the principle of first do no harm, by inadvertently introducing new risks into our operations. So specifically, when it comes to drones, they are not simply a neutral piece of equipment. In many places, their use is viewed with suspicion and often fear. Communities may not be able to distinguish between what is a humanitarian versus a private versus a military drone. There's also a lack of understanding of the purpose of their use, even in Australia, for example, what type of data they might collect and how might the data be used should it fall into the wrong hands. So thinking about these opportunities and challenges, it's really essential to keep interrogating how the use of these tools can remain compatible with and in service of humanitarian goals and principles. So to that purpose, over the last year in Humanitech, we've been exploring a range of practices and approaches to ethical, responsible, and inclusive innovation. And in collaboration with stakeholders across sectors and communities, we developed what we're calling a humanity-first prototype. This integrates components of human-centered design, system thinking, and co-design, along with considerations of ethics, accessibility, and the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which are centered around human dignity and around providing help to those in need without bias and discrimination. The intent here is to support those working with technology to investigate the long-term considerations and unintended consequences of their products as service. In its current form, the prototype has 9 principles, which are detailed on the screen. They focus on transparency and privacy, user choice and agency, ethical governance, and empowering people and communities to influence the design and decision-making process. At their heart, they're all about understanding the context, engaging with the community in the long term, fostering deep relationships, and really putting that future lens on what we are doing with technology in the contexts of humanitarian work. So we are now at a stage of consultations and testing, with feedback shaping and refining the design, form, and application of this prototype. And we'd absolutely love to collaborate with the ADM+S research community on this. So if this sparks interest, please do reach out because we'd love to have you engaged in this work. The previous slide was showcasing Airseed, which is one of the startups we are working with in our lab. And the lab is the primary vehicle through which we are currently testing some of these ideas that came out of the prototype. Airseed uses drones to conduct biodiverse ecological restoration, and they're currently working with landholders in Lismore and Ballina regions, restoring areas that were impacted by catastrophic flooding earlier this year. As part of their collaboration with us, Airseed is using humanity-first approach to help them deliver the project in a way that will enable them not only to provide biodiversity restoration, but also to support community resilience building. So the project aims to identify barriers to entry for drone use, to understand the potential community participation and engagement strategies, which can then help Airseed involve communities in decision-making throughout, not only throughout the project lifetime, but as long-term stewards of the project and the initiative. So to conclude, while tools such as drones can enhance provision of services to people and communities in need, it is really important to be careful for us in the humanitarian sector in particular to think about the potential implications of their use. Approaches that center human dignity in technology mean that we can think deeply about the consequences, and it also makes us take measures such as policies, design guidelines, and accountability mechanisms to avoid putting people in harm's way and avoid replicating existing inefficiencies or inequities. Ideas that have really sparked my curiosity along this journey have come from our collaborators over the time. So people like Bridget Engler from Swinburne University, who talks about being a better ancestor when working with art and technology. Or Kristen Alford from University of South Australia. She runs a wonderful museum of discovery there, and she talks about moving at the speed of trust. So really not gate crashing our way with these approaches and tools, but really taking our time to understand their opportunities as well as risks. And another one that I can highly recommend is Robin Mays from University of Washington, but also a colleague from American Red Cross, who is a humanitarian researcher who has posited this idea of community as headquarters of decision-making around the applications of data and technology. So when we think about putting these ideas into practice, this will allow us to collectively create digital tools and systems that benefit, not undermine humanity. There can be tools that protect people's rights and meet their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Kaspar Raats. Kaspar is an industrial PhD candidate at Halmstad University and works with user experience design and user research at Volvo Cars, Sweden. His work focuses on intelligent vehicle technologies and services, automation, trust, and human-centered algorithm design. Please join me in welcoming Kaspar.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you for having me here. So I work in Volvo Cars and I do my PhD exploring how can we design trustworthy intelligent vehicle technologies and services. So basically shared autonomous vehicles. In this context, for me, care means that when we design these solutions, then it's our responsibility to explore like a wide range of different alternative possible futures, not to like settle with this individual man usually driving a vehicle to work. And so, and then through this exploration to try to foresee or anticipate a little bit what the impact of such solutions can have on society. For example, a good example is the e-scooters that were promised to reduce the amount of driving, whereas it actually reduced how much people walk. And as a bonus, it has a lot of strain on the healthcare system due to the accidents. So also that the care is about that we reflect, we as the people who work with these topics, we reflect what's our assumption of the future mobility and what's our responsibility when we design it. Do we assume this individually owned vehicles, or should we start looking into more the community-based systems? Do we think that the first and last mile is a challenge, or maybe it's an opportunity for community members to build a community, because that's where they interact with their peers. Then the care is also the responsibility to engage then different stakeholders into designing it. So we don't try to solve the future mobility alone, but we engage like the cities and industry and academic researchers, as well as citizens, into this design process to then try to discuss the future of automated or autonomous mobility, and also then to respond to the changing needs, or the social needs and the values. And I think if we fulfill these responsibilities, then we can create truly trustworthy autonomous mobility solutions and create more useful and relevant solutions for people and their lives. So the other question was about how I have done it. So the main project, which you will hear about a lot during this symposium, and you see the posters in the back also, is the AHA2 project, so which is a design ethnographic living lab project about future urban mobility. I will only focus on a small part of it due to the time limit. I will focus on the part where we used a speculative design approach to do co-creative workshops with the citizens and the city stakeholders and industry stakeholders. So yes, we put together industry and the city. It wasn't completely easy, but it worked out in the end. I will later tell you about it a little bit. So this project is about focusing on 2 suburbs in Sweden. So and we engaged with the community members there. We did co-design workshops with them to understand what are their everyday practices and routines, and then use that knowledge or these insights to create speculative scenarios. So not absolute future solutions or visions, but more like a grounds to discuss around between different stakeholders and start reflecting on each other's roles and possibilities to collaborate in creating the solution for it and not messing up the world necessarily. So one of the key things in my work has been that we have grounded everything on this ethnographic real work, because it's so we don't have to guess what people want, and we don't have to talk about the first and last mile challenge, but we should actually understand what would help people in their lives and try to maybe fill their mobility gaps. As I said, I used speculative methods because they are really good to pull people out from their everyday constraints or this framework, and to explore what could be, explore some new perspectives on these topics. And so the project had like different stages, and the first I tried to have the designers to create these new narratives. So moving from this man driving a car to have maybe cater for people who have a limited mobility, or people in the wheelchairs, or maybe families with the kids. So we created, for example, 2 stories that we created, where one was about a person in a wheelchair, and then not necessarily being able to afford to drive this type of vehicle, or having access to it. So basically, what we tried to do with this speculations was to raise the frictions, to show that everyday life is not frictionless, and to create to show what could go wrong, especially to then explore things that are not necessarily explored otherwise, if the visions are created only by the industry. So we lifted the questions around shared responsibility. Let's say a group of parents who can decide if each other's kids can use a service, and then, for example, there was a kid who wanted to go swimming, and then wanted to bring his sister, but then another parents, they said it's okay to go, but they didn't know that the sister can't swim necessarily, and so what could be the implication of that? Or that if the kids don't behave well and now the family gets kicked out of the service, and or then that if you're not comfortable sharing with strangers, and then what are the safety issues, and how can we make people comfortable if there's no drivers, for example, in the car. So, and these speculations, and we created them into, or developed them as stories that we used in a wider group of stakeholders. So we had workshops with the city, academia, and industry, and also local community members. And then we explored like how does that impact each stakeholder's work, and what kind of responsibility we have in making these solutions to happen, for example. And you know, many thoughts came up when we use that type of way. That, for example, when we talk about vehicles that don't have drivers, and people feel less safe in sharing the ride with when there's no driver, because the driver acted usually as some sort of built-in safety mechanism, then could we have elderly people to contribute, and getting the elderly people getting a point of interaction, whereas the people who use the vehicles, they could feel maybe more comfortable and safe in this. And but I think the main thing was that when we used these stories that were grounded in the real life insight, or like the insights from the real life environments, and it helped. It created this type of neutral ground where the city stakeholders and the industry stakeholders could discuss. So we didn't have to. They didn't have to like battle. That is, the industry is pushing more vehicles into the city, and the city wants to push all the vehicles out, but they could actually solve issues together. And then in the end, they actually concluded that we need to do it together, and we can't like solve it alone. So, and this picture, I heard that a couple of years back when we presented our project here in Australia, there was this belief that the industry and the city can work together, and this is shows that there are members of city and academia and industry there, and they are working on city guidelines. So basically, which was that the city was moving or trying to explore that if it's possible to work not with the requirements, which they do at the moment, basically putting like the road crossings every 100 meters, to more guidelines that what kind of experience it should create for the citizens. That's it.
And now our final speaker is Zoe Condliffe. Zoe Condliffe is a data activist, gender advocate, researcher and founder and CEO of She's a Crowd. She's a Crowd is the biggest geospatial data set of sexual assault and gender-based violence in the world, and has collected upwards of 100,000 reports from survivors. Please join me in welcoming Zoe.
Can I use this instead? Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, if I stand. I don't like lecterns. Hi everyone, I'm Zoe. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the founder. Oh, that's my final slide. Can you please change it to my first slide? Thank you. Yeah, so I'm the founder and CEO of She's a Crowd, and we use crowdsourced data to make cities and spaces safer for women and gender diverse people and close the gender data gap. So gender-based violence is, I'm just going to move this so you can really hear me a little clearer. Okay. So unfortunately, we know that gender-based violence is still a ubiquitous experience across the world. And yet around 9 in 10 sexual assaults and incidents of sexual harassment are not reported to the authorities. This means that decision makers simply don't have access to the data that they need to understand and address the problem. We believe that if you can't understand a problem, you can't fix it. So She's a Crowd is changing that. Our safe and anonymous crowdsourcing platform allows any survivor anywhere in the world to share their story. And each story is geotagged and timestamped and aggregated for important insights, which we then provide to our customers, who are decision makers across government, educational institutions, private transport companies, and the like. So we provide these insights to our customers, and all of those customers have one thing in common. They desperately want to address this problem, but they don't know where to start. So since 2018, we've successfully built our survivor community of hundreds of thousands of survivors and have created the biggest geospatial database of sexual assault and gender-based violence in the world. Survivors tell me that sharing their story with She's a Crowd makes them feel heard, seen, and believed, sometimes for the very first time. And one survivor even told me the other week that after sharing her story with She's a Crowd, her recurring nightmares that she'd been experiencing years after her sexual assault finally ceased. So I've been working in gender advocacy since about 2016, when I pioneered Free2Be, which was Australia's first ever crowd mapping platform for street harassment with Phan International Australia. And I also designed and ran a program called the Youth Activist Series, which trained young activists to speak truth to power and advocate for safer cities. So back then, I remember leading this group of youth activists into metro trains in Melbourne. And we were meeting in a big conference room with some high-level transport executives and all of the directors, so that the young women and non-binary people could really speak their truth to power about how they experienced the city and transport. And I remember one of the men, the directors, said, "But we've got this emergency button. So what about that?" And one young woman proceeded to list out all the reasons why this safety button does little to help them ease their concerns and worries when they're traveling on trains. She said it doesn't consider the gendered nature of violence in public space, which is often covert. She said perpetrators are often opportunistic and will sit right up close or take advantage of peak hour to rub up against me. I don't want to squeeze past him to stand up and press a button. The conversation is then broadcast out loud to the whole carriage, which is embarrassing and could increase my risk. And then there's all the less tangible challenges as well, like the internal ones. So the normalization of the issue. So that's the idea that, oh, well, I guess it's not that big a deal. It happens to everyone. I'll just get on with my day. The idea that, the internalization of the issue, which is the idea that, somehow I had something to do with it, like maybe I shouldn't have been wearing that, or, maybe it's my fault, or maybe I'm not going to be believed. And then there's just a general mistrust of authority, which we know is experienced by some groups more than others and is often very well placed. Survivors would also have to overcome the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, which is really normal, a really, really typical kind of response to any sort of harassment or assault. So yeah, this button is not enough. And I remember then one young woman said, "What happened to conductors? Why can't I just go and talk to someone anymore?" They were craving that incidental friendly face, someone who represented authority but wasn't wearing a bulletproof vest, someone who might see something and know what to do about it. So we've been working with state government, transport departments, city planners, private transport companies over the last few years. And this year we decided to run a campaign to collect data specifically about rideshare. The rideshare industry is still relatively new, and like many gig economy industries, it relies on underdeveloped legislation to operate. So we'd come across a lot of survivors who actually told us that they used rideshare as a way to stay safe, to avoid that last mile home walk in the dark, or to avoid waiting for unreliable transport connections. So we wanted to ask, how safe is rideshare really? And this quote here is from Julie, who last year was abducted in a DD. And I'll get back to that a little more later. So we had over 600 rideshare stories come through this year as a part of that campaign. And we found that 22.5% of our respondents feel unsafe when interacting with CPV vehicles in Australia. And 19% of the incidents reported involved sexual assault. Of those reported experiences related to CPV, which is commercial passenger vehicles, you probably all know that, 26% believe that sexism was the biggest motivation behind the incidents of harassment and the sexual assault that they experienced. And incidents generally occurred at night, with 79% of respondents reporting that was the case. So I was personally not surprised when I saw these results came in. I've had 2 experiences of sexual harassment in Ubers. And I have to say, rating your driver 1 star just doesn't quite hit the spot in terms of validation, recompense, or accountability. So this is a breakdown of the different types of incidents that were recorded through our platform. We can see sexual assault, groping, intimidation, following, and catcalling are all the most common. We also noticed that only 8% reported the incident to police, which aligns with what we know more generally about reporting rates of sexual assault. And 5% actually changed the type of transport they take, and 14% said they stopped frequenting CPV or rideshare vehicles altogether. So this particular survivor told us, an Uber driver wouldn't let me out of his car without giving him a 5-star rating. He locked my door and stared me down. I was very frightened and worried he wouldn't let me out regardless, and drive off somewhere. He did let me out, only for me to be catcalled anyway while walking to my apartment lobby. We can use technology to improve things, but we need to be wary of not making the same mistakes again and again, which have seen cities designed primarily by and for able-bodied men. When technology emulates existing power structures, we invent new modes of oppression. So we worked with the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, Monash University, and the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, and with Jenny and Emma, who are here today, and closely with Julie, the young woman who I mentioned earlier, who was abducted in a DD, to turn her story into a short docudrama to illuminate the safety gaps in the rideshare industry and explore the particular vulnerabilities that women and gender diverse people face when simply trying to get from A to B. The film explores whether safety buttons are really enough to replace the informal passive surveillance and human component often missing from increasingly automated transport systems. And we're screening this film for the first time right here tomorrow at 4 p.m. So look forward to seeing you all there. And I just want to talk for a minute about what I was actually asked to do today, which was talk about our definition of care. So I was asked, what is our definition of care and how do we apply that to the work we do to build a feminist future in the era of automation? So we see ourselves as a bridge between survivors and legislators, designers and decision makers. We turn stories into data, which can help change the hearts and minds of people in power. The way we do this is firmly rooted in our values. So survivors come first. We've spent 4 years finessing the way we collect data and are only just now turning our energies fully towards delivering those data insights across Australia and the world. This has given us the opportunity to listen and learn from diverse and global and varied perspectives of survivors and understand the courage it truly does take many of them to share their stories. Yes, data is just information, but we believe that currently institutions prioritize the extraction of that data without fully understanding the implications that that has on the subject. By taking the last 4 years to design our products with anonymity, data security, and sensitivity in mind, we've been able to build a platform that survivors love to use. And they keep coming back to it as a place where they finally feel safe. This is something that's often taken for granted. If survivors don't feel safe in our physical world, then at least we wanted to create a virtual and online space where they could. Our commitment to learning has led us to build a chatbot which allows survivors to seek a mental health self-assessment and deliver feedback to She's a Crowd throughout their storytelling process. Over 10 million people visit our website every month, and 36% of them end up sharing their story through our app. We receive 300 to 600 stories each and every day. We emphasize the collective in all of what we do. In 2019, I delivered a paper with Riva Marathe at the SOAT conference in Perth, and we actually did a study of every women's safety app that we could find in the world. And we found that 79% of women's safety apps were being designed using a very paternalistic approach to addressing women's safety rather than an empowering one. Many of these were also being used to further perpetrate controlling behaviours and violence against women. So one of the ways that we combat this is by emphasising this collective approach. When survivors see that they're not alone, it contributes towards a process of feminist consciousness raising. This not only helps them with their healing process, but it moves them to reevaluate their affective feminist identity and their relationship with the world, with themselves, and with other survivors. So I'm currently at the Emerging Technologies Lab at Monash doing my PhD, which has involved researching how feminist consciousness raising relates to digital technologies and emerging new wave feminism. Many other apps take an individualistic approach to women's safety, such as panic buttons, or what I like to call virtual rape whistles. They also perhaps ask the survivor to change their behaviour in some way. But our commitment to social justice means that we look at prevention rather than response. And our theory of change relates to interrupting existing power structures and structural inequalities instead. So we aim to foster creativity and care internally in the way that we work. We have a trained social worker on staff who takes each of our team members through personal and professional goals development. And we talk about what we're grateful for in all of our team meetings. And I use a non-hierarchical feminist leadership approach, which understands leadership as seeing the potential in those around you and really facilitating boldness in my team. And lastly, perhaps my favorite is imagination, because we believe that if you can't imagine a better world, you can't create one. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to each of our speakers as well. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We've got Sally with the roving mic in the audience. Once again, if you're online, you're also welcome to ask a question. You can pop it in the chat. And we've got someone to ask that aloud for you as well. So to help kick us off, I thought I would start with the first question, which is around what Noortje was saying, care as a relationship that we enter into. Care is a relationship that we enter in with others. And I suppose a practical question I wanted to ask is, how do you get others to care? So in some of you who run workshops, for example, or who present to policy, people in government, people in industry, people who are very time poor and who have other cares, I guess you might say. How do you invite them into a conversation and to invite them to care about the thing that you're doing? Perhaps we'll start with Noortje and we'll work our way down.
You're starting with a nice, challenging question. I mean, I'm actually still thinking about Zoe's comment about an empowering versus a paternalistic approach to care, which I thought was a really interesting point. And yeah, it would be great if we could talk a little bit more about that. One sort of small anecdote from the simulator that connects both to that point, I think, and to your question, is something that happened when we first stepped into the simulator with our 25, 30 participants, and we would come in small groups of like 9, 10 because of capacity issues. And the lead engineer
that had, well, he oversaw the realization of the simulator. He gave a kind of an opening introduction, both to the simulator, but also to the vehicle that was there, the test vehicle, and all its features and functionality. And what I found very difficult about that moment was that all the attention of the group went to the sort of technical ingenuity of the place and the object. Now, of course, we had come to the simulator in trying to bring a different kind of orientation where we would be not so much preoccupied with, you know, the fantastic capacities of the technology, but about all the entities that it needed to somehow coexist with on the road and in society. But I think it does relate to your question in that at that moment, I, as a researcher who maybe was interested in care and building relations, I really needed to make time for the magic of this technology, which was doing a lot of the work of actually assembling us, of bringing us there. So I think this would be my sort of first answer, that when your purpose is to establish relationships, that you really need to allow for, you know, sensibilities and values and fascinations that, you know, maybe are quite alien to you. And yeah, so that's, I think, for me, a place to start.
Oh, beautiful answer. Ivana, did you want to jump in?
Thanks, Thao. Quite a juicy question to kick us off with. A few things that sort of went through my mind when you asked it. I went firstly thinking about the moment in time where we're at. I think we are at the point where the need to care of what happens if we don't get these things right around data and technology, around these futures of mobilities, is becoming almost, I guess, self-evident. I don't think there's a persuasion needed in terms of we need to invest to make sure that they're done responsibly, ethically, and inclusively. So that made me think about, you know, from a policy advocacy angle, talking about decision makers, how do you get them to care? It does come to that finding that shared interest, shared value, and pursuing your agenda in coalition, so that collective action in this space is really, really important. But building these relationships of care and these collective coalitions, if you like, it does go to that notion of Kristen Alford's around moving at the speed of trust. So meaning that, you know, relationships are built over time. They're iterative. They're showing through action and deeds your intent as opposed to just words. So they do take time to build and to demonstrate. And particularly when it comes to the mobilities area, I think really understanding the purpose, the benefits, making sure that engagement and communication is constant and builds on itself.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's a really important thing to say, particularly within the context of mobility, where so much focus is on getting us there faster, on efficiency and A to B, rather than, as you both have pointed out, taking the time and enjoying the journey. Zoe?
Yeah, I was just thinking, and I think, like, for us, I mean, basically like half of the population, I don't need to try and convince them to care because they live it and they breathe it and they just get it. Like that's their life. And so they already care. But then, so for me, this question is like, how do you get like men to care? Because, yeah, I mean, if I had $1 for every time that a man let me know that he has a daughter and a mother, actually, and a wife, and that's why he cares, I would be, yeah, maybe a little richer than I am now. But yeah, I think, so for us, it's like, what I noticed was, I noticed that, like, everyone knows this is going on. Like, we all have these stories, like these anecdotes we share amongst our friends. And then when I started working in gender advocacy, which advocacy is just like a fancy way of like getting people to say, like getting people to care, I think. I noticed that when we would like talk about this issue or push this issue of safer cities and gender-based violence and sexual assault. But when I put the stories on a map and I like showed the stories as data represented and visualized in this particular way, which was mapping, it was incredible what happened. Like I just saw like engineers who've been working, you know, in Melbourne, or designers, you know, who've been, you know, working in the field for like 20, 30 years. And I've never considered, you know, city planning from this perspective. All of a sudden would see this map and they'd be like, oh my God, you know, I've got this new like lens on this whole city, and that's now going to inform the work. And the same with like the conversations I had with the police or like any other type of authority or decision maker. So for us, we've actually used technology and used geospatial data and mapping stories to help to get people to care.
Kaspar?
So in our project, I felt like everyone does care, and you already mentioned, but it was really hard to hear anything there. So I will freestyle a little bit. So everyone seems to care, but many times when we work with the city stakeholders, they don't really know what to do with that. They don't know how to do it. So when we introduced the insights from the ethnographic field work, they were quite like happy and surprised, and they were almost like opened up that now we can maybe do something. And also when we tried through these speculative ways to work with this material and think what are the alternatives, the alternative visions for the future, it almost like helped them to start reflecting and maybe forming their ideas how to go forward with this question. And so, but it takes a lot of time. So it took us for like a year to get the vocabulary synced. You know, when we started in AHA 1 project, which is the same project but one, and then we, as an industry, we talked about users, and then the cities talked about citizens, but we actually talked about the same thing. So the project lead was like, but we are talking about the people. Yes, we are talking about people. So then we were synced so we could go forward with this. So I think it's, like you said, the different, we're learning also from different, how the others see it. For us, it took a long time to understand how the cities work. And every time we had a workshop, we came back, we didn't really understand how they worked until they started talking about requirements. And then we started realizing they work pretty much like engineers do, like the requirements, it's about numbers and so on. So.
Thank you. We've got a question in the audience there, and then another one at the back as well.
Hello, great panel, thanks. My name's Julia Powers from UWA. I have a question for Noortje, informed by the urgency of Zoe's presentation. And I was really fascinated by your way of illuminating constraints, particularly in the context of a conversation about societal acceptance. And I wondered how far we should go in responding to the urgency of constraints, and particularly what cannot be done. Because it seems to me that in the language of societal acceptance, which we see throughout narratives about automated mobilities, it actually numbs care and it numbs the response to what cannot be done. And it kind of introduces this temporal distortion that if we just understand enough, actually we will overcome those constraints, or will silence the voices, or will dilute them. And yeah, so I think, and I guess also with Ivana, whether the Humanity First prototype could actually have a response to the times when we come upon something that we cannot ignore and cannot be done.
Yeah, I have to tell you that I heard about 70% of what you say, because we have a machine blowing air behind us. So talking about constraints, but I'll try and engage under that condition. So, I mean, there are a whole range of points, I think, that I'd like to make, and I'll try and do it quickly. So I definitely believe that the discourse of societal acceptance has something, and its prevalence has something to do with the inability or the lack of developed capacities to actually envision societies in their diversity, in their specificity. So what are the communities? What are the situations where autonomous vehicles are to be welcomed or tolerated or coped with? So I think that's where sort of societal acceptance becomes the go-to, like, because all we need is acceptance, and acceptance doesn't require that kind of specificity of the where and the how. At least it doesn't require the imagination of it. Now, I think, as was clear from what I said, I'm very interested in going sort of all the way to the other end of the spectrum and say, we really need to find ways to work through these specificities in our engagements with engineers and others professionally and technically involved in realizing these futures. And I do think that CARE is really interesting in the way in which it is so often about what is not possible. So I am not able to take the time to use the car share option because I have 27 things to do, and therefore I need to just drive my daughter to school now in 12 minutes. And I think only if we work through those kind of sort of problematic situations can we start to imagine, a different way of futuring or giving a social future to automotive mobility. The difficulty, or one of the difficulties that I'm trying to work on, has to do with method. Because, for instance, with my work with the engineers in the West Midlands, there's a lot of commitment to also to, for instance, bring in gender specific approaches to automotive future. So, for instance, the phenomenon of the busy mom, is the scenario of the busy mom who can, send her kids to school while she goes to the dry cleaner. Like, these kind of scenarios get invoked also in the engineering side. But when I look at the actual arrangements and devices and methods for evaluating futures, I see none of these scenarios translated into the actual sort of technical conditions of validating, verifying for future use. And I mean, this is probably, if trust moves slowly, I think sort of methodological innovation probably moves, at least as slow, if not more slowly, because of course, these are incredibly well-established traditions. All kinds of paradigms of governing safety depend on the robustness of these methodologies for verification and validation. So yeah, I really think we're sort of, if this is where our commitments are, of course, engineers aren't the only constituency for us to engage with, but we really need to sort of stay for the long journey on this one.
There's another question at the back, and then we've got one over here as well. And I will just reiterate that it is quite hard for us to hear on stage sometimes. So we're doing our best, and I'll do my best to repeat if you can't hear it on stage.
Thank you all. Really thought-provoking panel, and it made me think, well, I think I'm interested more so in the humanitarian drones question here, but I think it speaks to all people on the panel. And I was wondering, Ivana, in your work, with the complications and the challenges that you face, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about those. Mostly in terms of humanitarian drones, in my reading of, for instance, how they're used in the UN peacekeeping context, all sorts of different challenges emerges, both human-centric and technologically as well. So I'm just wondering here, what sort of challenges are you seeing in the work that you're doing? And what sort of role do you anticipate or think about in terms of areas of experimentation and failure as well, and how failure factors into the sort of work you're doing and the ideas that you're developing? Sorry, that sounds really echoey, so I'm not too sure if that's helpful.
Thanks for your question, and I'll do my best to muddle through. So I do have to put it out there that I'm not a practitioner in drones or mobilities, but I have drawn very heavily on the work done in our sector to sort of point out some of the issues today. So for more detail, I can't highly recommend enough. The International Committee of Red Cross has a platform called Digitarium, where they've devoted a whole bunch of sessions and pulled together excellent resources on all of the questions that you were talking about. But essentially, when it comes down to it, in the broad range of humanitarian settings, which can be in domestic contexts, like in the aftermath of disaster, or working, for example, with AirSeed, as we've seen, to help communities that have been affected by disaster, but to help improve biodiversity, as well as in conflicts, for example. So there's issues of suspicion and distrust in these technologies, because these types of technologies have been used for a range of purposes. So that goes to that question of really making it clear where are those red lines in our sector, where perhaps the use of drones is not acceptable because it will not be accepted by the community, but also then that stakeholder engagement and clear communication. So really working with the community at the center, engaging them, making sure that we understand their concerns and can address their needs when it comes to these types of technologies. And when it comes to failure and experimentation, I mean, failure is a fabulous way to learn, but there are points in which we cannot go just for the testing and piloting sake and see what happens. The lines are too stark in our kind of work. So there's been this wonderful work coming out of Oslo by Sandvik, for example, and she speaks about this idea of humanitarian experimentation or humanitarian innovation that kind of crosses the line into experimentation without consent. And that is really critical sort of to think about, because the consequences for people in a context of vulnerability or crisis are much starker than perhaps for the general population. And we know from broader research that data and technology failures or harms, the brunt of those are often borne by people who are already marginalized. I hope I've kind of answered your question.
Please.
Oh, hi, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for all these really inspiring perspectives on care. I guess my question is more directed to Noortje. And I'm so glad that you mentioned to what extent the social relations around automobilities extend beyond the situation on the road. Because so much of what we've seen in the ethnography of the AHA project that Kaspar mentioned is how much driving others, but also the whole work of coordination around driving and making mobilities possible is about establishing and maintaining these relationships of care. So what I would like to know more about is how much these elements of kinship were part of the things that populated the imaginaries that you talked about, but also sort of how we can use maybe questions of care to step away from the vehicle, so to speak, methodologically, from your experience.
So how we can use questions of care to step away from the vehicle, is that right?
Yeah, it's a very, very good and hard question. Because one of the things that fascinates me, but that I don't often talk about, I have to admit, is the sort of the entanglement of the imbrication of the vehicle with the care relationship. So in my own life, I think I have to admit that care, to say, I care for my father, or I care for my daughter, or I care for a friend, and this is why I drive them, or in driving them, I care for them, that's a kind of a trope that I sometimes reach for in my personal life. And of course, there is a whole range of relationships that I don't name, that I don't mention when I produce that kind of a justification of my actions. So why am I the one? Why am I the person enabling them? Why is it that it comes to me that their sort of mobility needs are realized? And I think there's a kind of a double movement there that I would like to make, which is that given that the imaginaries of mobility and the the professional communities of mobility, at least in my part of the world in the UK, are very sort of male dominated, making explicit disentanglement of mobility and care and finding a kind of a language for it. I do think I need to have that courage, you know, to have that kind of problematization introduced into the discourse around what are we doing here in sort of envisioning futures of mobility, and where does the labor and where do the costs fall? And I think in a way that owning of the problem is quite necessary to then be able to populate the situation of driving and to see how it is entangled with much wider relations of paternalism versus empowerment. That's where I thought your comment of safety as a paternalistic concept really touches on some of these same issues. So it's, I mean, I don't want to sort of be overly therapeutic in how I framed our sort of task ahead, but I do think there is that kind of, only by bringing it closer can you then broaden your vision.
Yes, I'm glad you said that as well, because there's obviously another dimension of care, which is paternalism, which is a lot of things have been justified in the name of care. The colonial state and many policies in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's really inspiring to see the sort of methods that you are showcasing and the case studies that you're working with to return a different sense of care and to help us care about these things in the ways we should. So it's now 12 o'clock, which is the end of our panel. I'd like us all to thank our brilliant speakers today. Thank you all. We now have a 1 hour break for lunch, and we'll be back at 1 p.m. We don't have lunch catered today in an effort to keep this event as accessible as possible and to keep it free for anyone to register. It has meant we've let go of providing catering, but there is a discount code, I think, in the program for the Oxford Scholar, which is next door. There's also we're in the CBD, in like the biggest foodie capital in Australia. So there is a range of wonderful lunch options and we have plenty of time. So we've got an hour. So please welcome us back at 1 p.m. in this room again. Thank you all.